The morning Dylan Reeves set out for his solo trek through Yosemite's backcountry, the sky was a brilliant canvas of blue stretching endlessly above the granite peaks. It was September 2017, and the 34-year-old software engineer from Portland had meticulously planned this journey for months. A 5-day expedition along lesser-traveled trails where he could disconnect from the digital world that consumed his daily life. He'd left detailed itineraries with his sister Jennifer, marked every waypoint on his GPS, and packed enough supplies to last a week if needed. His truck sat in the parking lot near White Wolf, keys hidden in the magnetic box under the rear bumper, just as he always did on these trips. Dylan had been hiking these mountains since college, understood their moods, their dangers. He wasn't reckless, he was prepared. By the third day, when Dylan failed to check in via the satellite messenger he'd promised to use, Jennifer felt the first flutter of genuine worry. By day 6, when he didn't emerge at the designated pickup point, that worry crystallized into panic. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. The search began immediately. Yosemite's search and rescue team deployed within hours, bringing dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers who combed the trails Dylan had marked on his route. The terrain was unforgiving. Steep ravines, dense forests, and areas where cell service vanished entirely. Jennifer arrived from Portland within 24 hours. Her face drawn and pale as she handed over Dylan's meticulously organized notes, his backup maps, photographs of every piece of gear he'd taken. She insisted on joining the search parties, hiking until her legs trembled with exhaustion, calling her brother's name until her voice gave out. The weather had been stable during Dylan's trek. No storms or unusual conditions that might explain a sudden accident. His experience level made a simple getting lost scenario seem unlikely. Yet as days turned into weeks, the search area expanded to encompass hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The dogs picked up his scent along the planned route for the first 2 days, confirming he'd stuck to his itinerary initially. Then, near a junction where multiple trails intersected, the trail went cold. It was as if Dylan had simply stepped off the path and vanished into thin air. Search teams discovered his campsite from night 2, tent stakes still in the ground, a circle of stones where he'd built a small fire, even a wrapper from one of his energy bars wedged between rocks. Everything suggested a normal evening, nothing disturbed or out of place. But after that sight, there was nothing. No torn fabric caught on branches, no dropped equipment, no signs of struggle or injury. The official search lasted 3 weeks before being scaled back to periodic sweeps. Jennifer refused to accept this. She took a leave of absence from her job as a high school teacher, rented a cabin near the park, and spent every daylight hour walking those trails herself. She created flyers with Dylan's photo, his easy smile, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident, the details of what he'd been wearing. She posted them in every business, campground and ranger station within 50 miles. Local news covered the story for a few weeks, featuring Jennifer's tearful appeals for information, aerial footage of the vast wilderness where her brother had disappeared. Tips came in, each one investigated thoroughly, each one leading nowhere. Dylan's parents flew in from Arizona, devastated and desperate. His father, a retired police officer, applied his investigative experience to the case, interviewing other hikers who'd been in the area during that time period, reviewing weather data, studying topographical maps late into the night. His mother organized prayer vigils and community search efforts, refusing to speak of her son in past tense. "Dylan is out there," she would say firmly, though her eyes betrayed the growing despair. "He's strong, he's smart, we just have to find him." But as autumn turned to winter and snow began blanketing the high country, even the most optimistic volunteers began preparing themselves for the worst. The investigation revealed nothing suspicious in Dylan's personal life. No financial troubles, no relationship problems, no history of mental health struggles. His co-workers described him as reliable and well-liked, passionate about his weekend adventures, but equally committed to his job. Friends said he'd been excited about this trip, looking forward to photographing the fall colors and testing out some new camping gear he'd purchased. There was no reason to suspect he'd chosen to disappear voluntarily. His bank accounts remained untouched, his apartment in Portland exactly as he'd left it, his cat being cared for by a neighbor who grew increasingly heartbroken as days passed without Dylan's return. Jennifer hired a private investigator 6 months after the disappearance, spending her savings on someone who specialized in missing persons cases. They retraced every step, interviewed everyone again, examined photographs of the terrain from every angle. The investigator was thorough and compassionate, but ultimately found nothing the official searchers had missed. "The wilderness doesn't always give up its secrets," he told Jennifer gently. "Sometimes people just become part of it." She'd thrown him out of her cabin, refusing to accept such philosophical resignation when her brother's fate remained unknown. Years passed with agonizing slowness. Jennifer returned to teaching but never truly left Yosemite behind. She came back every summer, every autumn, walking those trails, always searching, always hoping. She'd aged visibly from the stress, new lines around her eyes, grey threading through her dark hair earlier than genetics would suggest. The anniversary of Dylan's disappearance became an annual pilgrimage, with friends and family gathering to hike together, to remember, to refuse to let him be forgotten. Local rangers knew her by name, treated her with gentle kindness, though they'd privately concluded Dylan had likely fallen into a ravine or crevasse where his body might never be recovered. Dylan's parents struggled differently with their grief. His mother created a blog documenting unsolved disappearances in national parks, finding grim community among others who'd lost loved ones to the wilderness. His father, always the pragmatist, began accepting that his son was gone, though he never stopped checking missing persons databases, never stopped hoping for some piece of evidence that might provide closure. The family dynamic fractured under the weight of their loss, some wanting to move forward, others unable to stop looking back. The hiking community rallied around the Reeves family in ways both touching and heartbreaking. Other solo hikers shared their own close calls, their narrow escapes from injury or disorientation, trying to explain how quickly things could go wrong even for experienced adventurers. But Dylan's case remained different somehow, the complete absence of evidence, the lack of any trail to follow, the inexplicable vanishing of someone who'd done everything right. It became a cautionary tale shared around campfires, a reminder that the mountains were beautiful and deadly in equal measure. By 2023, Dylan's case had gone cold in every practical sense. The official file remained open, but no one actively investigated anymore. Jennifer had returned to a semblance of normal life, though she kept Dylan's hiking boots in her closet, his favorite jacket hanging by her door. She'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in ambiguous loss, the unique grief of not knowing, of being unable to properly mourn, because some desperate part of her heart still insisted her brother might walk through her door someday, sunburned and apologetic for the worry he'd caused. That's when Marcus Chen, a geology graduate student from UC Berkeley, arrived in Yosemite for his research project. Marcus was studying abandoned mine shafts in the Sierra Nevada, documenting their locations and conditions as part of a larger effort to identify hazardous sites that needed to be sealed for public safety. The mountains were riddled with forgotten mines from the gold rush era and subsequent mineral extraction booms, unstable tunnels and vertical shafts that pose serious risks to unsuspecting hikers. Many were unmarked, hidden by decades of vegetation growth, known only through old mining records and local legends. Marcus had been working in the backcountry for 3 weeks, methodically checking coordinates against historical maps, when he ventured off-trail following geological markers that suggested the presence of an old prospecting site. The area was remote, several miles from any maintained path, in a region where granite outcroppings and dense pine forest made navigation challenging. He nearly missed the opening entirely, just a dark gap between rocks, partially concealed by overgrown manzanita bushes and fallen timber. His instruments detected the void behind the vegetation, indicating a substantial hollow space worth documenting. Using his machete to clear the entrance, Marcus discovered a vertical mine shaft descending into darkness. The opening was roughly 4 feet across, its edges supported by rotting timber frames that dated back at least a century. He secured his climbing rope, double-checking his safety harness before beginning his descent with his headlamp, cutting through the gloom. The shaft dropped about 40 feet before opening into a small chamber where early miners had followed a quartz vein into the mountainside. The air was cold and stale, tinged with the mineral smell of ancient stone. That's where Marcus saw the boot. It was positioned at an unnatural angle, partially covered by rock debris that had fallen from the deteriorating shaft walls. Marcus's heart began racing as his light swept across the scene, revealing what he desperately hoped not to find. A body wedged against the far wall of the chamber, mummified by the cool, dry air inside the sealed space. The clothing was modern, technical hiking pants, a moisture-wicking shirt bearing a familiar outdoor brand logo. Near the body lay a backpack, its fabric faded but intact, and scattered equipment that told the story of someone who'd fallen into this forgotten trap. Marcus scrambled back up the shaft with shaking hands, his mind reeling from the discovery. He immediately radioed the ranger station, his voice tight with the shock of what he'd found. Within hours, a recovery team arrived with specialized equipment, preparing for the delicate task of retrieving remains from the confined space. Jennifer received the call at school, in the middle of teaching her 4th-period American history class. The ranger's voice was careful, professional, explaining they'd found a body in the backcountry, evidence suggesting it might be her brother, but they'd need dental records for positive identification. The next 48 hours existed in a strange fog for Jennifer. She drove to Yosemite in a daze, barely remembering the journey, her mind caught between hope and horror. Hope that they'd finally have answers. Horror at what those answers would be. The recovery operation took an entire day. The shaft was unstable, requiring additional safety measures before they could safely extract the remains. When they finally brought Dylan up into the sunlight after 6 years in darkness, Jennifer wasn't allowed to be present, but she waited at the ranger station, surrounded by family and friends who'd rushed to be with her. The identification came quickly. Dental records confirmed what Jennifer had already known in her heart. The body was Dylan's. The medical examiner determined he'd died from the fall itself, likely within minutes of the accident. The shaft had been invisible from ground level, concealed by vegetation and positioned just off the established trail system. Dylan had probably stepped wrong, breaking through the covering of branches and debris that had accumulated over the opening, plunging into the darkness before he even understood what was happening. His GPS device, recovered from his backpack, showed his last recorded position was within 50 feet of the shaft location, but the search teams had never found it because it was hidden so completely by the landscape. The investigative team reconstructed Dylan's final days based on evidence from his body and belongings. He'd been following his planned route, had camped at the designated sites, had been on schedule, and apparently in good spirits. On the morning of September 15, 2017, he'd left his campsite and begun hiking toward his next waypoint. At some point during that day's trek, he deviated slightly from the main trail, perhaps to investigate something interesting, perhaps to find a better angle for a photograph, perhaps simply to answer nature's call. That small deviation had led him directly to the hidden mine shaft. The recovery brought a strange mixture of emotions to the Reeves family. Relief that they finally knew what had happened, that Dylan hadn't suffered for days in the wilderness, that he'd been found at all. Devastation at the random cruelty of it, that an abandoned hole in the ground, left behind by men who'd been dead for over a century, had killed their son and brother. Anger at the incomplete records of mine locations, at the thousands of similar hazards still lurking throughout the Sierra Nevada, at the impossibility of making the wilderness truly safe. Jennifer organized a memorial service at a small church in Mariposa, the gateway community to Yosemite. Friends from Portland, co-workers, hiking buddies, and even people who'd only known Dylan through the search efforts filled the pews. Rangers who'd looked for him attended in their dress uniforms. Marcus Chen sat in the back, still processing his role in finally bringing Dylan home. People shared stories of Dylan's kindness, his adventurous spirit, his terrible jokes around campfires, his dedication to environmental conservation. His mother spoke about the comfort of knowing, of being able to properly say goodbye, even as she wished the knowing hadn't come with such pain. Dylan was cremated, and Jennifer carried his ashes back to Yosemite one last time. She hiked to the site where he'd been found, the area now clearly marked with warning signs, the mine shaft properly sealed by the Park Service. She'd brought his favorite camping mug, filled with wildflowers, and left it near the ceiling as a memorial. As she scattered his ashes among the pines and granite, she spoke to him the way she'd been speaking to him for 6 years, telling him she was glad he was home, that she could finally stop searching, that she hoped he'd found peace in these mountains he'd loved so much. The discovery prompted a renewed effort to locate and seal abandoned mines throughout California's public lands. Marcus's research project expanded into a comprehensive mapping initiative, using ground-penetrating radar and historical records to identify hundreds of similar hazards. The Dylan Reeves Memorial Safety Fund was established to support this work, raising awareness about the hidden dangers that existed alongside the beauty of America's wild places. Jennifer became an advocate for wilderness safety, speaking at hiking clubs and outdoor recreation events, sharing her brother's story not to frighten people away from nature, but to encourage preparation, awareness, and respect for the mountain's unforgiving power. Dylan's body had been remarkably preserved by the conditions inside the mine shaft, the cool temperature, the dry air, the sealed environment that prevented decomposition. This preservation allowed the medical examiner to provide detailed findings about his final moments. He'd landed on his left side, the impact causing immediate fatal trauma. His backpack had still contained most of his supplies: food, water purification tablets, his first aid kit, the emergency beacon that had been crushed in the fall and rendered useless. In his jacket pocket, they'd found his phone, its battery long dead, the screen cracked from impact. When they later managed to retrieve data from its memory, they discovered photos he'd taken that final morning, pictures of the sunrise, of a deer he'd spotted, of the trail ahead looking peaceful and inviting. Jennifer kept one of those photos, the last one Dylan had taken, an image of the forest path, dappled with morning light, pine needles carpeting the ground, the kind of scene that captured why he'd loved these expeditions. She had it framed and hung in her classroom, a reminder of her brother's joy, his passion for the natural world, his life beyond the tragedy of his death. Students would sometimes ask about it, and she'd tell them Dylan's story, turning his loss into a lesson about living fully, about pursuing what you love, about the importance of safety and preparation when venturing into wild spaces. The years following Dylan's recovery were a process of adjustment for the Reeves family. The certainty of his death was both relief and renewed grief. They'd been living in limbo for so long that the finality felt like losing him all over again. His mother closed her blog, finding she no longer needed the community of the searching, though she stayed in touch with several families she'd connected with over the years. His father finally cleared out Dylan's apartment, which had remained untouched all that time, carefully packing his belongings and distributing them among family members who wanted pieces of him to keep close. Jennifer returned to teaching with a new perspective on loss, on resilience, on the ways people cope with the incomprehensible. Her students noticed she was gentler somehow, more patient with their struggles, more understanding when they faced difficulties. She led a school hiking club, teaching teenagers how to prepare properly for outdoor adventures, drilling them on safety protocols, making them promise to always tell someone their plans. Some of them rolled their eyes at her caution, but others saw the pain behind it and listened carefully, understanding they were receiving lessons purchased at a terrible price. The hiking community in Portland held an annual memorial hike in Dylan's honor, choosing different trails each year, always pausing at the summit to share stories and toast his memory. These gatherings became spaces where people could talk openly about the risks they accepted when they ventured into the wilderness, the thin line between adventure and tragedy, the way they'd all had close calls that could have ended differently. Dylan's death had stripped away the illusion of safety, replacing it with a more mature understanding that respecting nature meant acknowledging its power to harm as well as heal. Marcus Chen completed his graduate degree and continued working on mine safety projects throughout the West. He never forgot the moment he'd found Dylan, the weight of being the one who'd answered a family's 6-year-old question. He corresponded with Jennifer occasionally, updating her on the progress of sealing operations, sharing when they discovered and secured another hazardous shaft. Each one sealed felt like a small tribute to the man he'd found, a way of ensuring no other family would wait years for answers the way the Reeves family had. The Park Service installed a small bronze plaque at the trailhead Dylan had used for his last hike. It didn't mention his death specifically, but rather celebrated his love of Yosemite and served as a subtle reminder to hikers about staying on marked trails. Jennifer had helped compose the inscription, "In memory of all who find peace in these mountains, and in honor of those who protect others by sharing their stories." It was exactly the kind of understated memorial Dylan would have appreciated, nothing maudlin or overly sentimental, just a quiet acknowledgement that these places demanded both love and respect. On September 15th, each year, Jennifer still made the drive to Yosemite. The anniversary never got easier, but it became something different, not just a day of grief, but a day of connection with her brother's memory, with the landscape he'd died loving. She'd hike shorter trails now, staying well within marked boundaries, always with a partner, always with her satellite beacon active. She'd find a quiet spot with a view of the high country and spend time there, sometimes talking to Dylan, sometimes just sitting in silence, feeling the wind that had touched his face, seeing the peaks he'd photographed countless times. The case file on Dylan Reeves's disappearance was officially closed, with the notation, "Accidental death due to fall into unmarked mine shaft." The simplicity of that statement belied the years of searching, the thousands of hours spent looking, the emotional toll on everyone who'd known and loved him, but it provided something the family had been denied for 6 long years, an ending. Not the ending they would have chosen, not the one where Dylan emerged from the woods with an incredible survival story to tell, but an ending nonetheless. A place to stop searching and start remembering. Jennifer eventually wrote a book about her experience, titled The Years Between. It wasn't a mystery or a thriller, but rather a meditation on ambiguous loss, on living with uncertainty, on finding ways to continue when part of your heart insists on waiting. She donated all proceeds to wilderness safety organizations and search and rescue operations. The book found an audience among others who'd lost people to the wilderness, to accidents, to the random cruelties that could reshape a life in an instant. Readers wrote to tell her how Dylan's story had helped them process their own losses, had given them permission to feel both grief and gratitude simultaneously. Dylan's friends from Portland stayed close to Jennifer, forming a kind of extended family, bonded by shared loss. They'd gather on his birthday each year, making his favorite meal, sharing new adventures they'd had, keeping his memory alive through stories that grew more polished with each telling. Some had children now, kids who would hear about Uncle Dylan, even though they'd never met him, who absorbed the lesson that life was precious and unpredictable, that you should tell people you love them because you might not get another chance. The Dylan Reeves case became something of a reference point in discussions about wilderness safety and the legacy of abandoned mines in the American West. Environmental groups and outdoor recreation advocates used his story to push for more comprehensive efforts to locate and secure these hazards. Legislation was proposed requiring better documentation and remediation of abandoned mine sites on public lands. While progress was slow, the bureaucratic machinery grinding at its typical pace, each new shaft sealed, each new warning sign installed, represented incremental movement toward preventing future tragedies. For Jennifer, healing came gradually, measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small moments when she could think of Dylan without immediately feeling that crushing weight on her chest. She could laugh at memories of his terrible singing voice without the laughter dissolving into tears. She could see someone wearing the same brand of hiking boots he'd favored without feeling like she'd been punched. She could make plans for the future without that nagging voice insisting she should be searching instead. The grief never disappeared. She'd learned it wasn't something you got over, but rather something you learned to carry. But it transformed from an acute agony into a chronic ache, present but no longer debilitating. Years after Dylan's recovery, Jennifer met someone, another teacher, a man named Robert who'd lost his sister in a car accident and understood the particular loneliness of grief. They bonded over shared loss, over understanding what it meant to live with absence, over building lives that honored the dead while embracing the living. When they married in a small ceremony at the edge of Yosemite Valley, Jennifer carried a photo of Dylan in her bouquet, including him in the celebration the only way she could now. The mine shaft where Dylan had spent 6 years remained sealed, its location now well documented and clearly marked. Sometimes hikers would pass the spot, noticing the warnings, perhaps wondering about the story behind them. Most would continue on their way, grateful for the caution, unaware of the specific tragedy that had prompted such thorough closure. But occasionally, someone would stop, would perhaps sense the weight of that place, would take a moment to appreciate the reminder that these mountains, for all their beauty, were not designed for human comfort or safety. Dylan's story became part of Yosemite's collective memory, joining countless other tales of people who'd found both joy and sorrow in these peaks. Rangers shared it during safety briefings, outdoor educators referenced it in their courses, and the hiking community passed it along as a cautionary tale wrapped in tragedy. But more than a warning, it became a story about a man who'd loved these mountains enough to risk himself among them, about a family who'd refused to stop searching, about a graduate student who'd provided answers when everyone else had given up hope. In the end, Dylan Reeves hadn't vanished without a trace. He'd left behind evidence of a life fully lived, a family forever changed, and a legacy that would potentially save others from similar fates. His 6 years in that dark shaft, while unspeakably tragic, had led to meaningful changes in how abandoned mines were addressed in wilderness areas. The boy who'd fallen in love with hiking during college had become, in death, an inadvertent advocate for the safety of everyone who followed in his footsteps. Jennifer sometimes wondered what Dylan would make of everything that had happened after his fall. The searches, the memorials, the safety initiatives, the book, the annual gatherings of people who'd never met him, but who remembered his story. She liked to think he'd be embarrassed by the attention, would make some joke about not needing all this fuss, would insist people should just get out there and hike safely rather than sitting around talking about him. But she also knew he'd be proud that his accident had meaning beyond itself, that the random tragedy of his death had been transformed into something that might prevent others from suffering similar fates. On clear nights, when Jennifer looked up at the stars from her home in Portland, she'd sometimes think about Dylan in that mine shaft, about how close he'd been to his planned route, about how the search teams had passed within yards of where he lay without ever knowing. She'd think about the strange mercy of his quick death, about how much worse it could have been if he'd survived the fall, only to die slowly in the darkness. She'd think about Marcus Chen discovering him, about the odds of that particular graduate student being in that particular place at that particular time. The universe had taken Dylan from her family randomly and cruelly, but it had also eventually given him back. The mountains remained exactly as they'd always been, beautiful, dangerous, indifferent to human hopes and fears. Dylan had understood that, had accepted it as the price of admission to places that stirred something in his soul. He died doing what he loved, in a place that mattered to him, on a perfect autumn morning when the air was crisp and the light was golden and the world was full of possibility. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. Jennifer held on to that something as she moved forward through the years, carrying her brother's memory and his love for the wild places, honoring him by living fully in the world he'd been taken from too soon.